The air was thick, not with the morning mist Arthur knew from the streets of Manchester, but with a suffocating mix of sea salt, gunpowder smoke, and a pungent metallic smell he would soon learn to associate with blood. The landing boats swayed violently, throwing the young recruits against each other, their faces pale beneath their steel helmets. The sound was an orchestrated hell. The roar of naval cannons, the dry crack of rifles, the sinister hum of bullets passing too close, and beneath it all, the screams, the groans, the desperate cries of men who had already met their end. Arthur clutched his rifle to his chest, his sweaty hands slipping on the cold wood. His blue-gray eyes, accustomed to the monotony of textile machinery, now struggled to process the landscape of chaos unfolding before him. "Come on, lads! Get out of that tin can!" Sergeant Davies's grave, hoarse voice cut through the din, a command that brooked no hesitation. Arthur stumbled out of the boat, the icy water of Anzac Cove rising to his knees, dragging him back. The sand, once pristine, was now stained red and dotted with the inert bodies of his comrades. The smell of death was overwhelming, a sweet, fetid odor that clung to his throat. He felt his stomach churn, but there was no time for weakness. Ahead of him, Sergeant Davies was already on the beach, a robust giant with a thick, grizzled beard, his deep brown eyes scanning the terrain with an intensity that seemed to see through death itself. The smell of tobacco and gunpowder seemed ingrained in his clothes, a constant aura of his life in the army. Davies was a man who had seen many wars, and every scar on his face told a story of brutal survival. He didn't speak much, but every word was a command, every glance an order. His presence was a rock pillar amidst the torrent of sand and blood. Arthur ran, the weight of his equipment pulling him down, the sound of his own footsteps muffled by the pandemonium. He saw other recruits fall, some with a scream, others in silence like rag dolls. Fear, a cold, paralyzing sensation, began to settle in his chest, squeezing him like a vice. He remembered the farewell at the train station, his mother's tight embrace, the scent of lavender on her dress. "Come home, my Arthur," she whispered, her tears streaming down her aged face. "I promise, Mom," he replied, his voice choked, unaware of how empty that promise would soon sound. The image of his younger sister, Lily, waving a white handkerchief, an innocent smile on her face, was a cruel contrast to the reality that was engulfing him. He had promised her too, a promise of stories of bravery and glory, of a triumphant return. Now, the only glory he saw was that of surviving the next second. "Forward! Don't stop!" Sergeant Davies shouted again, pointing to a rocky outcrop. The platoon, a heterogeneous group of frightened youths and hardened veterans, began to move, crawling and running under enemy fire. Arthur felt the rough sand scratching his face, sweat stinging his eyes. He could feel the heat of nearby explosions, the tremor of the earth beneath his feet. Every step was a struggle, every breath an effort. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to follow the man in front of him, Sergeant Davies, the only compass in his world of chaos. War was not like the recruitment posters. There was no glory in the bullets tearing through the air, no heroism in the cries of pain. There was only fear, dirt, and the incessant march forward towards an uncertain fate.
The days dragged on in brutal monotony, broken only by sudden explosions and the deadly hiss of snipers. The rocky outcrop Arthur's platoon had reached was now their home, a labyrinth of hastily dug trenches where life and death mingled in a macabre dance. The smell of damp earth, sour sweat, and the distant putrefaction of unburied bodies was a constant, an invisible veil that covered everything. Flies, fat and persistent, were a plague, landing on any exposed food, on any open wound. Water was rationed, warm and metallic tasting, and food, hard biscuits and canned meat, barely met the needs of exhausted bodies. Arthur, whose hands were once soft from working with fine fabrics, now had calluses and blisters, the result of endless hours digging and reinforcing the earth walls. His eyes, once filled with innocent curiosity, now carried a shadow of weariness and constant vigilance. He learned to sleep standing up, to eat quickly, to ignore the hum of bullets and the groans of the wounded. Life in the trench was a primal existence, reduced to the most basic needs: survive, eat, sleep, and fight. It was in this particular hell that Arthur met Corporal William Will O'Connell and Private Benjamin Ben Carter. Will, a tall and slender Irishman, with flaming red hair and freckles that dotted his face, was the platoon's comic relief. His green eyes, full of vivacity, contrasted with the paleness of his skin, and his melodic accent, even when exhausted, was a song amidst the din of war. Will was a born storyteller. His narratives, often exaggerated and full of dark humor, were a balm for the tormented souls of the soldiers. He used humor as a shield, a way to ward off the darkness that surrounded them. "Now, lads, if we can't laugh at death, what's left for us?" he used to say, a wise smile on his lips as he shared a cigarette with Arthur. The smell of smoke, mixed with that of cheap tobacco, was one of the few comforts left. Ben, on the other hand, was the personification of innocence, a robust young man with broad shoulders and large hands, accustomed to hard work on his family's farm. His fair, almost white hair was always tangled, and his blue eyes, though gentle, revealed an almost childlike simplicity. The smell of earth and hay seemed to follow him even in the dirt of the trench, a constant reminder of a purer world. Ben was the youngest of the group, and his unwavering faith in God and victory was a striking contrast to Sergeant Davies's cynicism and Will's humor. He read his small Bible every night. His whispered prayers were a strange and comforting sound in the tense silence of the night. "God is with us, Arthur," he would say, his voice calm and sincere, even when bullets ricocheted off the trench walls. Arthur, who had lost faith in many things since setting foot in Gallipoli, found a strange peace in Ben's conviction. Camaraderie formed quickly, an invisible web of mutual support. They shared rations, told stories, and protected each other from enemy fire. Sergeant Davies, though maintaining his tough demeanor, watched his men with a look Arthur began to recognize as a form of affection. He was the father, the protector, the man who would keep them alive, no matter the cost. In a rare moment of calm, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Arthur found himself thinking of Manchester. The smoke from factory chimneys, the constant hum of the city, the smell of coal and fresh bread. He remembered the long hours in the textile factory, the hypnotic rhythm of the machines, the constant buzzing that was the soundtrack of his life. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was his, predictable, safe. He saw his mother, sitting at the sewing machine, the soft sound of the needle piercing the fabric. He saw Lily running through the green fields on the outskirts of the city, her fair hair flying in the wind. The promise of a better life, of adventure, of glory that had driven him to enlist, now seemed a cruel joke. The only adventure he knew was that of survival, and the only glory that of not going mad. He closed his eyes, trying to retain the image, the smell, the sound of home, before the darkness of the trench swallowed him again.
The air in the trench was heavier than usual, laden with a palpable tension that came not from dampness or dust, but from fear. The orders had arrived the night before, whispered from mouth to mouth, like a slow poison spreading through the platoon's veins. An attack. Not a simple advance to gain a few meters of land, but a large-scale offensive, a desperate push to break through the Ottoman lines. The objective was a distant hill, a strategic point that seemed inattainable, guarded by machine gun nests and barbed wire. Arthur felt a chill in his stomach, a tight knot that prevented him from breathing deeply. He observed the faces around him, each reacting in their own way. Some were pale and silent, others smoked nervously, their hands trembling. Sergeant Davies, impassive as ever, checked each man's equipment, his eyes scanning every detail, as if he could find a flaw that could cost a life. "Keep formation, lads, and don't look back," he growled, his voice a muffled thunder that, somehow, brought a strange comfort. He was the rock, the pillar that prevented the structure from collapsing. The smell of his tobacco, mixed with the smell of sweat and fear, was the perfume of that morning. Ben, with his worn Bible in his hands, murmured prayers, his lips moving silently. His blue eyes, usually so full of innocence, were now teary, but his faith seemed unshakable. "God will guide us, Arthur," he whispered, a faint smile on his lips. Arthur wanted to believe, wanted to feel the same peace Ben seemed to find in those words, but his heart pounded erratically, a frantic drum in his chest. He remembered a summer day so many years ago when he and Lily ran through a field of poppies, the warm sun on their faces, her laughter echoing in the air. The carefree innocence of childhood, the promise of a cloudless future, seemed a distant dream, almost unreal in the face of the imminent reality. Will, always the joker, tried to break the tension with forced jokes, but even his humor seemed to have lost its sparkle. "Well, lads, if hell is this, at least we'll have a good story to tell our grandchildren, if we have grandchildren, of course," he said, attempting a smile, but his green eyes revealed the same apprehension everyone felt. He lit a cigarette, the flame flickering in the dark of the trench, and offered one to Arthur. The bitter smoke filled Arthur's lungs, a small relief from the anxiety that consumed him. Time dragged on, each minute an eternity. The distant sound of Allied artillery began to intensify, a prelude to what was to come. The ground trembled, and dust and dirt fell from the trench walls. Arthur gripped his rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon in his hands. He was not a hero, never considered himself one. He was just a young man from Manchester, a factory worker who had traded the factory for the battlefield. But there, at that moment, he was a soldier, and his fate was sealed. The fragility of life had never been so evident, so palpable. Every breath, every heartbeat was a gift, a miracle that could be taken away at any moment. Fear was a constant companion, a shadow that followed him, but he knew he couldn't give in to it, not now, not with his comrades by his side. Sergeant Davies gave the signal, an almost imperceptible nod. It was time to face the inevitable. Sergeant Davies' sharp whistle tore through the air, a piercing sound that echoed the cry of thousands of other whistles along the front line. "Advance!" The word was barely heard above the roar of artillery that now rained down on the Ottoman positions with a deafening fury. Arthur, his heart pounding in his chest, propelled himself out of the trench, the weight of his rifle and pack seeming to triple. The sun, which moments before seemed an indifferent observer, now shone mercilessly over the desolate landscape, revealing the extent of the field of death that stretched before him. The advance was a race against death. The ground, once firm earth, transformed into a swamp of mud and debris, dotted with grenade craters and twisted bodies. The smell of burnt gunpowder and charred flesh was nauseating, mixing with the metallic odor of fresh blood. Bullets whizzed like angry wasps, and the sound of their impacts against the earth, or worse, against flesh, was a constant. Arthur saw a man beside him fall, a dark smoking hole where his face had been. There was no scream, just a dull thud, and the silence that followed, more terrifying than any sound. He ran, his leg muscles burning, his lungs begging for air. His eyes, wide with terror, tried to register everything, but his mind refused to process the brutality. It was a blur of movement, sound, and horror. He stumbled, almost falling, but a strong hand pulled him up. It was Will, his green eyes fixed on Arthur, a mixture of fear and determination. "Keep moving, Arthur. Don't look back," he shouted, his voice almost inaudible in the pandemonium. Ben, a little ahead, ran with an almost blind determination, his faith propelling him through hell. The platoon advanced in waves, falling and rising, each man a small island of courage in an ocean of despair. Sergeant Davies at the front was an imposing figure, his silhouette outlined against the smoky sky. He fired his rifle with deadly precision, his hoarse voice encouraging the men. Arthur felt a warm dampness on his cheek and realized they were tears, mixed with sweat and dirt. Fear was a physical presence, a tightness in his throat, an uncontrollable tremor in his hands. He remembered his mother's face, the worry in her eyes when he left. Her image, so vivid, so real, was a reminder of the world he had left behind, a world of safety and love so distant from that field of death. Suddenly, a different sound, a low, growing hum that turned into a deafening roar, an enemy plane. Arthur looked up just in time to see the dark shadow pass over them, followed by a rain of bullets that tore through the air. He threw himself to the ground, face in the mud, body trembling. When the sound subsided, he lifted his head, his heart pounding. Beside him, a young recruit he barely knew lay motionless, eyes open and empty, fixed on the sky. The brutality of war was relentless, indiscriminate. There was no time for mourning, only for the next breath, the next step, the next attempt to survive. Arthur got up, mud clinging to his clothes, the taste of earth and fear in his mouth. He gripped his rifle, feeling the cold metal against his skin. The fear was still there, but something else had been born within him, a cold determination, a will to fight, not for glory, but for survival, for the memory of those who had fallen, and for the promise he had made to his mother. The aftermath of the attack was almost as terrible as the combat itself. The cries of the wounded echoed through the night, mingling with the groans of the dying. The earth, once a battlefield, was now an improvised cemetery dotted with bodies and fragments of lost lives. Arthur and Will, exhausted and covered in mud and blood, crawled back to the relative safety of the trench, their bodies aching, their minds numbed with horror. Sergeant Davies, with a superficial arm wound, supervised the counting of the men, his face a mask of weariness and resignation. Each unanswered name was a silent stab in everyone's heart. The trench routine, already brutal, became even darker. Dysentery and typhoid spread like wildfire, decimating more men than enemy bullets. The smell of disease and decomposition was constant, and the sight of strong men wasting away in a matter of days was disheartening. Hope, a luxury few could afford, began to fade. Will's jokes became rarer, his green eyes losing their sparkle. Ben, the unwavering optimist, began to cough. At first it was just a dry cough, but it soon turned into a violent fit, leaving him breathless. His blue eyes, once full of faith, now carried a shadow of fear. Arthur and Will cared for him as best they could, sharing their meager water rations and trying to keep him warm. But the disease was relentless. One night, as the full moon illuminated the desolate landscape, Ben began to hallucinate. He called for his mother, for his farm, for a world he would never see again. Arthur held his hand, feeling the fever burn. Will, sitting beside him, murmured prayers in Irish, his tears silently streaming down his freckled face. The smell of sweat and sickness filled the small space. At dawn, Ben took his last breath, his eyes fixed on a distant point, a faint smile on his lips, as if he had found the peace he so desperately sought. Ben's death was a devastating blow to Arthur and Will. It was the loss of innocence, the confirmation that in that hell no one was safe. Sergeant Davies, upon learning of Ben's death, merely nodded, his eyes deep and tired. "Another good lad," he muttered, his voice hoarse. There was no time for mourning, no room for pain. War demanded that they harden, that they become fighting machines, devoid of emotions. But Arthur felt the pain, a deep, searing pain that added to his physical exhaustion. He remembered a family Christmas, the smell of pine and biscuits, Lily's laughter as she opened her presents. The joy of that day seemed a distant dream, almost unreal in the face of the grim reality that surrounded him. Life was a thin thread, and with each passing day, another thread broke. Arthur and Will grew even closer, united by pain and the need to survive. They were the last remnants of a group that had arrived in Gallipoli full of hope and bravery. Now, only resignation and the determination to carry on, one day at a time, remained. With every step, every breath, Arthur felt the weight of those who had fallen, the responsibility to carry their memories. The fragility of life was a daily lesson burned into his soul. Despair was an enemy as dangerous as the Ottoman bullets, but they refused to give in. Not yet. Not as long as there was a breath of life in their bodies, a spark of hope in their hearts.
The Gallipoli sun, which once seemed indifferent, had now become an enemy, punishing the few survivors with its relentless heat. The order came, cold and concise, like an axe blow, a final attack. There was no more strategy, only the desperate attempt to gain ground, to show that there was still strength, even if it was just the strength of stubbornness. The platoon, now reduced to a handful of exhausted and disillusioned men, was sent on a mission they all knew was suicidal. The hill ahead, a mound of earth and rocks, seemed like an altar for sacrifice. Arthur felt fear again, a chill that ran down his spine, but this time it was different. It wasn't the blind panic of the first day, but a bitter resignation, the acceptance of an inevitable fate. He looked at Will, whose green eyes, once so full of life, now reflected the same exhaustion and the shadow of death. Will merely nodded, a sad smile on his lips. Sergeant Davies, his arm bandaged and his face marked by fatigue, gave the final instructions, his voice hoarse but firm. "Do what you can, lads, and may God help us." The smell of gunpowder and sweat was the fragrance of that silent farewell. The advance began. There was no more shouting of "Advance!" Only the dragging sound of boots on dry earth, the metallic clinking of equipment. Enemy fire came immediately, a rain of bullets and shrapnel that tore through the air. Arthur ran, his body moving purely by inertia, his mind in a stupor. He saw men fall, one after another, without screams, without laments, just the dull thud of their bodies against the ground. The sound of gunfire was deafening, a macabre chorus accompanying the dance of death. Suddenly, an explosion. Sergeant Davies, who was at the front, was thrown backward, falling heavily. Arthur ran to him, his heart aching. The sergeant was conscious, but a deep wound opened in his chest, blood staining his tunic. "Go, Arthur! Don't stop!" he coughed, blood bubbling on his lips. His brown eyes, once so firm, now were clouded, but still carried the determination of a leader.
With a final effort, Sergeant Davies raised his rifle and fired at the enemy position, a final act of bravery, a sacrifice to give his men a few more seconds. The smell of blood was strong, metallic, and Arthur felt the bitter taste of loss. Arthur hesitated, but Will pulled him, dragging him forward. "He's gone, Arthur! There's nothing we can do!" Will shouted, his voice choked. They continued to advance, the last of their platoon, towards the hill. Bullets continued to rain down, and Arthur felt a strong impact on his shoulder. The pain was excruciating, but he continued, driven by adrenaline and the sight of Will ahead of him. They were almost there, a few meters from the top, when a dry shot echoed. Will staggered, his body contorting, and fell. Arthur threw himself beside him, blood flowing from his own wound. Will was pale, his green eyes fixed on the sky, a faint smile on his lips. "Tell them I tried," he whispered, his voice failing, and then silence. The smell of earth and blood was all that remained. Arthur was alone, the last one. The pain in his shoulder was excruciating, but the pain in his heart was even greater. He looked at the sky, an intense and indifferent blue. He remembered the promise he had made to his sister Lily, that he would return home. Her image, waving the white handkerchief, was the last thing he saw. He raised his rifle, the familiar weight in his hands, and fired. There was no more fear, only a cold determination, a last stand. He knew it was the end, but it wouldn't be in silence. It wouldn't be without a fight. War had taken everything from him, but it wouldn't take his dignity. He was Arthur, the young man from Manchester, and he would fight until his last breath. The sound of gunfire continued, but now it was only his. He was the last, and he knew silence would come soon.
The sun, which once seemed an indifferent observer, now dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, as if the sky itself were bleeding. Arthur lay on the ground, his rifle fallen beside him, his body heavy and inert. The pain in his shoulder had spread throughout his body, a wave of heat and cold that consumed him. The sound of gunfire had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant groan of a wounded man and the whisper of the wind blowing over the battlefield. The smell of gunpowder and blood still hung in the air, but now it was mixed with the sweet, fetid aroma of death, a scent he would never forget. His eyes, once so full of life and fear, were now fixed on the sky, a deep blue that was beginning to darken. He no longer felt the cold nor the pain, only a strange lightness, as if he were floating. Images of his life flashed before his eyes, like an old film. The factory in Manchester, the sound of machines, the smell of oil and cotton, his mother, with her calloused hands and tired smile, Lily, his younger sister, running through the fields, her fair hair flying in the wind, her crystalline laughter, the promise to return home, a promise he knew he would never keep. He remembered the poppy field, the warm sun on his face, the carefree innocence of childhood, the peace he so longed for, the peace he had lost in Gallipoli, now seemed so close, so palpable. He thought of Sergeant Davies, the hardened veteran who had sacrificed himself to give them a chance. He thought of Ben, the naive young man whose unwavering faith had been broken by the brutality of war. He thought of Will, the joker who used humor as a shield, but who deep down feared dying alone. All were gone. All. The war had claimed their lives, one by one, without distinction, without mercy. There was no glory in death, only the cold, relentless reality of the end. A final breath escaped his lips, a puff of air that mingled with the wind. His eyes slowly closed, and darkness enveloped him. The silence deepened, a silence that spoke of lost lives, shattered dreams, a future that would never be. The battlefield, once a stage of horror and despair, was now just a cemetery, a silent monument to the price of glory. And in the midst of it all, Arthur, the young recruit from Manchester, found the peace that war had denied him. Only the wind continued to blow, whispering stories of bravery and sacrifice, of men who fought and died in a distant land, under an indifferent sky. And the silence of death, was the only answer.